Relationships before rules. All behavior is communication. Breathe.
This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and welcome to Season 2 of This Restorative Justice Life. Today, we're welcoming Nancy Riestenberg as our guest. Nancy has had over 30 years of experience in the fields of violence prevention as well as restorative justice measures in schools. She has worked with school districts in Minnesota as well as 20 other states. In this episode, she talks a lot about policy changes as well as restorative justice in schools. Before we get into this episode, I would like to remind you that we have launched our TikTok, which you can find at amplify.rj in the show notes below. Without further ado, let's get into this episode.
Nancy, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
So, my name's Nancy Riestenberg, and I am the daughter of Babe and Bob Riestenberg, and I am the granddaughter of Fred Moore, who got some land. He bought some land from the railroad, who got the land from the U.S. government, who took the land from the Dakota and the Ojibwe people. And so I'm the descendant of a settler.
Who are you?
I am partner to Bob and mother to Jono and Catherine, and walker to my dog Burton, and a happy member of a neighborhood in South Minneapolis.
Who are you?
I'm a German Catholic farm girl who grew up and went to the city because she wanted to know what people did in offices.
Who are you?
I'm a speech, theater, and English teacher. That was my undergraduate degree, and I taught for a couple of years. And one of my finer teaching moments was standing on my desk wrapped in a white sheet, because I was doing a presentation on the Greek origins of theater.
Who are you?
I'm a restorative practices student. I have been learning about the subtle ways of the circle process, the profoundness of repairing harm, the ways in which the ways in which I have learned to be in this world can be oppressive to other people as a white person, ways that are really subtle and sometimes quite obvious.
Who are you?
Well, I'm a consultant. I do talk to people around the country. And I do that primarily because it teaches me what other people are doing around the country in regards to restorative practices. Anytime anybody thinks that I have something to tell them, I would just say that I get back twice as much from anything that I give, because of what I have been given.
And finally, for now, who are you?
I'm a gardener. I'm a cook. I like to make little quilts to give to people as circle centerpieces, and I'm going to be knit a little sock toy for my neighbor who's going to have a baby in a couple of days.
Mm, beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. Nancy, it's always good to check in, and I know we did it a little bit off air, but to the fullest extent of the question that you want to answer for everyone listening here, how are you today?
Today is a pretty good day. Mondays are always a little discombobulating because I forget that there are time schedules that need to be attended to. But for the most part, it's a good day. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you and to meet you. It's great.
That feels so good. You're someone, for those who have been studying restorative justice for a while or any amount of time and looking at books that are published, works that have been published specifically around this work with young people, your name is one that often comes up. And so I'm equally, if not more excited to be having this conversation. Aside from that, in the midst of summer, it is one of those times where so transparency, when this airs, I will be off the grid, pretty close to you, hopefully, in Yellowstone National Park, which is going to be a much needed break from all of this. But it's been a really busy, exciting time sharing this work with folks, but also looking forward to taking breaks. You've been at this work for a long time, and this isn't the question that I told you that we were going to start with, but as you've been at this work for a long time, what has sustained you and kept you going 30 something years in the process?
Oh my gosh, I haven't added it up for a while.
Yeah.
The thing that has sustained me is, I guess there are two things. One is that I believe in the basic principles of restorative justice. I was raised Catholic, and the idea of seeking forgiveness is a really profound component of my understanding of that faith. But there was precious few details given about how you go about doing that. How do you repair relationships? How do you fix things on this plane? And then the other thing that has definitely sustained me is the community, the people that I meet, the heart that they share, the fact that there can be a pretty quick connection that is not just based on knowledge, but really based on the heart work that is part of restorative practices. And I like to talk, and I have learned to listen. So those are really sustaining things for me.
Yeah, I definitely hear that part about community, and we're going to get into some of the communities that you've been a part of. But as we shared, you've been doing this work for 30, whatever the number is, years. Maybe even before you knew the words restorative justice or restorative practices. How did this journey get started for you?
Well, there's a concrete date, and that is 1994, when I was hired to work at the Department of Education. That was the same year that Kay Pranis, a couple months earlier, was hired to be the restorative justice planner at the Department of Corrections in Minnesota. And it wasn't too long after that where I had the opportunity to hear her and some of the people that she brought in to talk about restorative justice. I would say that before that, as I said, there was always this notion in my mind that we needed to, even when I was a little kid, take into account everything that was going on around any incident of harm. Kids would get into trouble in school, and I knew their lives in a way that maybe the teacher didn't, because I went to a two-room schoolhouse, and I knew that all the boys who came in had gotten up in the morning, probably about 6 o'clock, to do chores before they even came to school, and that their behavior maybe was due to the stresses that happened in the community and the neighborhood. And it seemed to me that they were always the ones who got into trouble, and that didn't make a lot of sense to me. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me that there was something missing in the way in which my teacher handled those situations. And so I always wanted kindness, I guess. That's the easiest thing to say. I wanted kindness in the way in which people responded, and understanding in the way in which people responded to kids, and not just a quick kind of punishment that was humiliating. And that was the other thing that was really difficult for me. I was very sensitive to, and still am, to people being embarrassed or shamed. And I just didn't think that was a good way to treat any person. And so when I learned about restorative justice, I felt like, oh my heavens, here is a way of answering that question. Mm-hmm. Not that we we are ever able to eliminate embarrassment or shame. Those are, they're useful for us as human beings. But the way in which we handle it could be much more humane. And the other thing that was really significant to me before I knew the phrases restorative justice, I started my work after I left teaching after a couple of years, mm-hmm. and I worked for a theater company that had plays on social issues: child sexual abuse prevention education, domestic violence prevention education, HIV/AIDS prevention education. And all of that prevention education really pointed to helping teach small people social emotional learning skills. Mm-hmm. And being able to identify their feelings, knowing how to resolve conflicts in a way that used words rather than, hitting someone, being able to problem solve and to think things through, being able to calm yourself down or settle yourself. And so we were encouraging people to teach that in schools as a means of preventing these really horrible social ills. And yet our schools were not equipped to practice them themselves. So it doesn't make any sense to teach a child how to read and then never expect them to read, mm-hmm. not use that in any other way. And the same thing was the case if you're going to teach social skills to kids and you're not expecting them to use them in the most difficult situations. What's the point? How do they practice? And how do they get coached in real time? And so when I learned about restorative practices, it's like, well, yippee. Here is the way that we can be congruent from the beginning to the end. We teach kids social skills, we teach adults social skills, and we expect everyone to use them even in the most difficult of situations, even when somebody has been mean to someone else, even when somebody has hurt someone else or stolen something from someone else. We can use these skills in a way that solve problems rather than shame, blame, and humiliate, or exclude for that matter. Yeah. And so on a theoretical level, it was like, oh, here it is. This is the answer. And this just sort of completes the whole circle of education around social skills. And the other thing that connected to that really was that if you're going to teach anybody anything, mm-hmm. you have to be in relationship with them.
Sure.
You can't teach somebody through intimidation. They'll learn something, but it's probably not Pythagorean's theorem. They're going to learn mm-hmm. something else, right? Mm-hmm. But they're not going to learn very well what it is that the concepts or the ideas or the theories that you're wanting people to learn. But if you have a relationship with them and you build up a sense of trust, then, oh my gosh, students will do anything for people that they trust. Practically, they will work hard. They will learn, and they will learn in a way that will help them retain what it is that they learn. And so, okay, so if we're supposed to be an educational institution and we're supposed to be about learning, we have to be about relationship And if we're going to be about relationship, we have to be able to have the abilities to repair relationships as well as build them. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to fulfill our role. We're not going to be able to teach anybody anything.
Yeah, there's so much in there that I want to dive into. One thing quickly, Brene Brown talks about the difference between shame and guilt. Do you differentiate between the use of those phrases?
Yeah, she knows more than I do, but yes, I can on a pretty simple level. Guilt is I did something wrong, and shame is I am wrong. That there's
and you're saying like shame is like a helpful tool. Like, did you want to
expand on that?
Yeah.
My understanding of that is that shame is something that we are born with, that it's part of being a human being, and it helps us to stay in relationship with people. It is an alert to the fact that things are not going well with someone. So I say something and it feels like it fell wrong on the ears of the person that I was talking to. I get a feeling, I personally get that feeling all the time. And so I have to go back and go, I just want to check in with you. Was this okay? Did I miss something? Was I misunderstanding? And so shame does help us stay in connection and relationship with each other. The challenge is that cultures around the world have interpreted those natural feelings in a variety of ways, and have come up with a variety of ways, I think, to help us manage it. And so how the Maori may deal with shame is probably really different from what majority culture does with shame in the United States.
Gotcha. No, thank you for clarifying. As much as like words are important, like as long as we have like a mutual understanding of what words mean, it really helps the conversation move forward. I wanted to connect two things, right? You are part of how you describe yourself is an educator, someone who has worked with young people. When you were a young person, you identified how people working in education, adults, were treating people unfairly, weren't building those relationships, weren't getting to know the other young people in your class and treating them with the respect, the honor, the dignity that they deserved given the circumstances. They weren't building relationships. If that was your model, what led you to want to be an educator?
Well, it was, it's interesting about human beings. Human beings are not just one thing.
Sure.
They're good, they're bad, they're indifferent, they're brilliant, they're fallible, they're all sorts of things. And the very person who pointed out to me in my own mind that you don't want to humiliate people was also the person who taught me how to read. And I loved school. And she was, in many respects, a really gifted teacher. And so I wanted to be a teacher. And I think that I had a facility for it. I like to talk. I like figuring out, like a lot of educators, you like to know something deeply and then explain it to other people whether they want to hear it or not, right? You just really are, you're just really happy to be able to explain things because, oh my gosh, I got a new metaphor for that one. And how would you like this one? And does that make more sense to you? I think it came from both impulses, to want things to be better and to want to be, an educator came from the same place. And I guess, perhaps it's genetic. I don't know. My grandmother was a teacher. My aunt was a teacher. When I was a little girl, I think maybe was in first grade. I would go over to visit my grandmother and my aunt. They lived together on Sundays, and my aunt would allow me, to correct the spelling tests. So she'd give me the red pencil, and she'd give me the key, and she'd give me all these papers, and I would get to put the check mark next to the ones that were wrong, and I got to write down the percentage, and so if it was 100%, I got to do that with a little swing at the bottom to sort of, cheer everybody up, and that was so cool.
As a child of a teacher myself, right? When you put the 100, I was like, you put 2 dots in the zeros and like a smiley face underneath it. So I feel that I didn't take that path long term, but I'm curious. You had models of in many ways a punitive, shaming, very rules-driven, objective-driven education system. And you described in more words than this, but you can't teach people content. Like, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Right.
Where did that shift for you in your journey towards education and working with young people?
I think that's been a lifelong journey.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of things I didn't know when I first started teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know I didn't know how to use my personality and my ability to connect with kids in a conscious way.
Mm-hmm.
I just knew that I could connect with people, right? But I didn't think about it. Nobody asked me to think about it, about what were the elements that I would use that would help me be connected to students. And so that's been something that I have been learning, and I've been learning, where I can do it better. I have for most of my career, except for about, somewhere between about 12, 13 years, I worked primarily with adults.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the same, right? Because it's the same. The relationship between the teacher and the student is the same. And, helping people make connections with each other and establish relationships with each other so that their amygdala will be calmed down and they can connect to their frontal cortex is part of the job of a teacher. And so, over the years, I think I have learned what my strengths are and where I can, make things more strong, more congruent. Because when I went through teaching, I was preparing to be a high school teacher, and they really just expected you to know content.
Right.
And people didn't talk about classroom management or classroom engagement or anything. You were just, if you were lucky enough to have a big enough personality to command the room, then you could maybe start teaching and figure out from there. And if you weren't, it was hard. It was really hard.
Yeah, I imagine people are picking up some of those things in the midst of our interaction from you sharing at the very beginning, you standing on a table. And there's some other things. I'm curious, which of those things you feel are inherent to you, and what are the things that you've developed as skills along the way?
I think that what I'm good at as a teacher is I can come up with a variety of ways of explaining something.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in what I'm talking about, and I think that that's really important when you're trying to engage somebody. I have learned to be more explicit about the fact that I always liked what I did. I've learned to be more explicit about being clear that I like the people that I'm around.
Mm-hmm.
It's a subtle thing, but one of the things that I heard about most recently was, could a teacher show that on their countenance and in their eyes in particular, show that they're happy to see kids as they walk into the classroom? And that was not something that I ever consciously thought about. I was glad to see my students because I had an audience. I was glad to see them because they were funny.
Mm-hmm.
I was glad to see them for a whole host of reasons, but I didn't think about consciously deciding to be glad to see them. And it was dynamic, and I liked the dynamism of it. There's a level of improvisation that you have to have when you teach, and I liked that quite a bit. It's a performance. I like performing, but the way that if I were to go back into the classroom now as doing a sophomore English class, I would do it entirely differently.
Yeah. I mean, I think about how you're sharing, content is one thing. but what are the relationships? How are you building those? That's what we're here to talk about, right? When we're
Right.
thinking about restorative justice, we're not thinking about classroom management. We're thinking about how are we treating each other? How are we in good relationship? How are we in right relationship? How are we building those relationships proactively? And so when there is harm, we can more easily navigate those and come back into alignment. I'm curious, what the inflection or the transition to restorative justice in the Department of Education from classroom was like.
You mean going to the Department of Ed? Well, so I had intermediary years. So I taught for a couple of years in Minnesota in high schools, and then I worked for a couple of years for the Guthrie Theater in their educational program. And so that's where I sort of transitioned really to working primarily with adults. And then I got a job with the Illusion Theater, and they, as I said, had social plays. And so those plays oftentimes were paired with trainings or workshops, and I learned how to conduct those workshops, and they were almost always with adults. We also did a lot of performing for high school students and elementary school students, large quantities of them, 300 kids, 500 kids, 1,000 kids in an auditorium. And that was where I learned to really explicitly be able to handle difficult responses and reactions, maybe inappropriate answers to questions that I might ask in a way that was as caring and as kind as possible. And that was a tall order, and I had an excellent teacher in Cordelia Anderson, a mentor and friend of mine, because we were talking about issues having to do with sexuality. And as you can imagine, that's kind of exciting for young people. And so there was that process. And then I went from working at this small nonprofit to working at the Department of Education, and which is a large state agency. And what a small nonprofit does is very different from what a state agency does. We're responsible first and foremost for the people's money, and to be sure that the money is used in the way that the legislature, who are the representatives of the people, want it to be used. Mm-hmm. And we are responsible for providing support to all of the schools in the state. And so it was a very different, it's not a classroom. It's a very different kind of entity. It has political components to it, right? There are lots of people's opinions about how education is supposed to be. And yet it is also something, education has a body of research that helps to support it. What have we learned that works best for students and for staff? And so figuring out how to support the schools as much as possible was really, really significant. When I came to the Department of Education, I had the good fortune of having a supervisor who very much, before I ever learned about the social control window, very much believed that we needed to work with our schools, that we needed to be in partnership with them, that we needed to ask them what they needed. We needed to not assume that we, as people who worked at the Department of Education, knew how to do things.
And really quick interjection, folks. I imagine most people know what we're talking about when we're talking about the social discipline window or social window of control, or as it's been phrased in multiple different ways, but boxes of doing things with, to, for, or ignoring problems with people.
Right.
And, we talked about it with Dorothy Vandering. We talked about it with Malik Muhammad on previous episodes of this podcast. So if you want to dive deeper into those, continue.
Yeah, right. Right. But so Carol Thomas was, that was what she believed was important. She came from a community organization, and she believed that the most significant thing we could do was be, as much as we possibly could, work with our schools and our community organizations that we engaged with. And so that was my introduction to state government, that you work with. Mm-hmm. And that has just been really, really helpful. Really helpful.
Yeah, and so you were doing this work, bringing ideas around. I guess, how would you frame the language that you were using in 1994 to work with schools and teachers to do this work to get better outcomes for students? Like, were you using explicit words around restorative justice in
Oh no,
1994?
those words didn't happen until 1996.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I can describe better the practices.
Yeah.
So as I said, a state agency is responsible for managing the money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my team got a significant amount of money from the federal government and also from the state to do violence prevention education.
Okay, yeah. There you
And
go.
so what we did was we would ask when people applied for money, we would ask members of the community to review the grants. If there was a grant that was supposed to go to a school and was supposed to be applied to students, we would make sure that we had young people on the review team. And so that's a simple example of the importance of doing with. Mm-hmm. And when we had the opportunity to ask people what they needed, how we could improve our work, that was another example of doing with. You tell us how we make this application better. So that's better than the words that I used. But then in 1996, we had the opportunity to explain restorative practices to schools, restorative justice to schools. And so a document was written entitled Restorative Measures Respecting Everyone's Ability to Resolve Problems. And again, the width was very much part of that, where we went around to different schools that were behaving in a restorative way according to this new frame that we had, this new language. And it wasn't as though there weren't people who were not doing this before those phrases. They certainly were. But we got examples from them to help illustrate the ideas that we were presenting. One that sticks out for me is an ALC that, she was just really adamant about the fact that you just don't send kids away. Mm-hmm. And you work with them and you help them figure out how they can be in the classroom in a better way. Another example was of a safe and drug-free schools program where if you were supposed to be, drug-free and to be able to be a mentor, and a student slipped and was seen smoking a cigarette, instead of kicking the student out of the program, they talked with the student and said, well, you need to go talk to the parents of the child that you've been the mentor of and figure out whether or not you can continue this relationship. And so that was an example of people recognizing that people make mistakes and that you can fix them and helping them figure out how they can fix them.
Yeah, and then when we came to zero tolerance policies a couple years later, right? Uh-huh. How were you navigating those very conflicting ideologies about, yeah?
Well, that is an interesting question. The thing that I always leaned on in regards to zero tolerance policies was something that one of the lawyers at the Department of Education pointed out to me in the law. Mm-hmm. I think that came out of a law in 1990, 1991, 92, something like that. Safe and drug-free schools, something or other. And it said that it was initially that a student shall be expelled from school for a school year if they bring a gun to a school. And a gun is a weapon that expels a projectile using an explosion. So this wasn't about knives, and it wasn't about nunchucks, and it wasn't about anything else. It was just about guns. Mm-hmm. And there was a line in there that said, at the discretion of the school board. So this was it was never written so that it absolutely had to be, because the local control, the federal government knows that it's best to always leave decisions about education up to the schools, the states, and the school boards. And so I would always say that, yeah, you have to do that, but it's at the discretion. It's at the discretion. And one of the things that we knew was that, so there were these policies, but there were other things that people could do if they decided to, because there was that discretion, and everybody always had discretion. Yeah. It was either formal or informal. And so if you continue to say, there's another way of doing this, there's another way of doing this, there's another way of doing this, perhaps some people will do it.
Yeah, and I think that really gets to the title of one of the things you've written, like circle in the square. I've often said that, like, I don't believe restorative justice belongs at school, ... institutionally, right? These circle ways of being don't align to the policies and practices written. And what can you do to tend to the relationships, right? From your framing, how do we bring these circle practices, these circles ways of being into these boxes that are schools that have these very rigid, these are the things that you have to do, these are the way that you have to be. And of course, for those listening, we will link the book in the show notes. But how have you seen people struggle with that and navigate those ideas of zero tolerance, or like, hey, this is what's written versus this is what the relationship requires?
Right. So there, two things come to my mind. One is going back to first principles, and constantly challenging people to be able to adhere to what sometimes is referred to as the 3 pillars of restorative justice, Howard Zare, where he talks about harm and needs, obligations, and engagement. Mm-hmm. And so you identify the harm and what the needs are as the result of the harm. And then there's the question of who has obligations to meet those needs. And the challenge very much in a school, as well as in general society, is that it's always more than, I would say, than just I bonk you on the head and you have needs and I have needs. Because if this happened in the lunchroom, if this happened in the locker room and there was no supervision, if this happened because nobody noticed that I was, distressed when I came to school, that there were no practices. Or you had been
harassing me every day for the last hour.
Or, yes, all of those sorts of things. This school has obligations. Society has obligations. And so that is the challenge, to help people recognize and think beyond, just as we want people to think beyond restorative justice as being something that is only a response to harm, that it is actually about a whole mindset. We also want people to recognize that when you are talking about harm, you have to think broadly about the question of obligations. And I would suggest that a school almost always has obligations that they have to meet in order to address the harm that has happened. The other thing is that one of the things that was really curious to me, just an amazing aha, when I learned about restorative justice, and I'm learning about it from the Department of Corrections, is that everything in a school seemed to run in a parallel track to the criminal justice system. So if the criminal justice system came up with 3 strikes and you're out, schools came up with 3 strikes and you're out. If the criminal justice system came up with a zero tolerance about X, Y, and Z, schools did the same thing. And as a result, the disproportionality numbers in the criminal justice system in Minnesota mirrors the disproportionality in suspensions and expulsions in the schools in Minnesota. It's amazing. And even though we're talking about way different things, there's a big difference between trying to ensure safety in the community and trying to teach small children. I don't care if they're 6'5". If you're 15, you're a kid. Mm-hmm. Even if you're 17, you're a kid. Even if you're 21, to a certain extent. So anyway, so what we have in schools are policies that have their own version of red lines, if you will. And those policies need to be taken apart, and they need to be cleaned up. In some instances, they need to be put outside so the mold will disappear in the sunlight. And so the other big lift, if you will, for making a school a restorative school is to do that policy work. And it is a challenge. Because in order for a school to revamp their policy, they probably really need to engage in a 3 or 4 year effort where they talk to everybody and they constantly are questioning things. And then it's a question of continuous review. They're supposed to review their policy every year anyway, but it needs to be done with an equity lens. It needs to be done with an eye towards best practices in regards to child development. The question needs to be asked, if this is in the criminal justice system, this is my opinion, do you think it belongs in a school? Does that really make sense to have something that sounds like it comes from the criminal justice system as a policy in a school? And I guess the other thing that is always the challenge in any practice is whether or not your data supports the work that you're doing. And if your purpose is to be educating children, and if you know that the evidence shows that the best way for that to happen is for a child to be present in the school, then that raises questions about practices that would keep a child out of the school.
Or a classroom for
or
the
a classroom
ISS crowd, right?
Right. all of that sort of thing. Right. Absolutely. If you're keeping somebody from direct instruction,
Mm-hmm.
then
I guess like
that's
the
a
step
question.
farther being like, and in good relationship, right? I think a lot about how, you said this is a 3 to 4 year process to overhaul policies. And when people hear that, that is like, oh my gosh, where do we begin? What do you say to people who are overwhelmed by that?
Hey friends, quick interruption. Restorative justice work, as we know, is all about relationships. Part of that is the relationship with ourselves, part of that is our relationship with people interpersonally, and part of that is the relationships that we have with the institutions and organizations that we're a part of. Since we originally recorded this episode, some things have changed in the Department of Education in Minnesota. And so before we released the episode, Nancy wanted to make sure that the things that we're sharing were as updated as possible. So we re-recorded this portion of the podcast to make sure that you had the most up-to-date information. So we're going to drop this re-recorded part of the interview in here, and I'll let you know when we're back to the original recording.
Where do we begin in trying to change policy so that the policy is more restorative? I think the process of policy review is something that happens as schools are trying to implement restorative practices. I think that the need to change policy will be exposed as deans and administrators, principals are trying to become more restorative, and they will see that there are parts of policy that are not useful, that maybe restrict their ability to be more flexible, to respond to harm as opposed to thinking about discipline as control. So there's not a quick fix for it. There's not a one-size-fits-all kind of model policy that can be handed over to a school district. Each school district's policy should be written in consort or in harmony or with collaboration with the community, with community partners, with family members definitely, with students absolutely, with the staff absolutely, where people are talking to each other. And I think the time that it takes to make those changes might be longer than people would expect. Because once you make one change, that might expose something else. So it just takes me back to the fact that policy needs to be continuously reviewed to ensure that it is supporting the school in the way that the school and the members of the community need to be supported. And I guess I would say that it is helpful to know the history of discipline policy in the United States. That might make some of the challenges within policies more evident. So, for instance, a lot of the policies are around exclusion and assimilation, that we wanted people to be a certain way. And so we wrote policies that reinforced certain norms. And there are also some aspects of policy that definitely try to exclude certain people. I think one of the things that might not be obvious on the face of it, when you think of not having disrespect, disorderly conduct, or the 3 Ds, I always forget the third D. If you're, of course you would want to be in a school where people were not disrespectful, and that they were not disorderly, and that people were paying attention. But those are such subjective terms. What is disorderly for you might not be disorderly for me. What is disruptive for you might be just a good joke and an opportunity for levity for me. And so that's one of the places where we see in discipline policy a kind of maybe unthinking exclusion of certain kinds of kids, and it seems to be particularly African American students, Black and brown students writ large, Indigenous students, and students with disabilities, and that those terms are applied to those people, to those students, and it is used as a means of sending them out of the classroom and sometimes having them suspended. So knowing that we as a country, as we were building our educational system, that we started with some of those notions, and that you can still see them if you look hard enough within the school, that helps you to decide what it is that you want to use and what it is that you don't want to use. We have a large proportion of schools in the United States that still allow corporal punishment. There's no evidence that that is useful in an educational setting, but it is something that a lot of schools are still allowed on the books, at least, to do. And so those policy needs to be reviewed on a continuous basis to be sure that it reinforces the first goal of education and the values of the community.
Yeah. Well, one, I think that third D is defiant, right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Defiant. Yeah.
There's that, and like needs and values, right, is a lot of what this work is about, and those things are ever evolving, ever changing as different people come in out of communities, as we go through different periods of time. That's never static. We need to constantly review those things. I'm curious, what are some of the changes? Because you've been doing this work for a minute, right? When you've moved from, hey, we made this policy change. Actually, this policy change no longer serves us in our community. Can you tell a story of a time where you've had to make a shift from your shift?
A shift from my shift. Well, that's interesting. I guess from my vantage point, I naively thought, there were lots of naivetes that I had at the beginning, that if you just said in the policy that the principal could use a restorative response in lieu of all of the other responses that were available to him or her, that would be enough, that would suffice. And so then instead of suspending someone, the principal could refer the student to a repair of harm process. Well, what happens with that is that you get another form of disproportionality. Maybe you're only referring white students to a restorative process because you trust them, right? Or your own implicit bias thinks that they could do it. Or maybe you don't understand restorative principles very well. Or maybe you're referring all of the Black and brown students to a restorative process, but you're not referring anybody else. So just putting that in policy, yes, you can do a restorative response, I realize is not enough. And so that's one really glaring example. Understanding more the interplay of educational law that schools need to follow, the policies that the school board makes, the actual practices of people in the offices, those are all, they're interconnected, and yet they can sometimes operate separately from each other. And trying to figure out how you can make everything mesh together is, it requires effort. And I think that people are in a better place now to be more thoughtful about how they are using their policy and what kind of changes need to be made to it in order to be restorative, because there are more people who understand more deeply what it means when we say restorative. They have a better understanding that you need to be you're restoring a relationship. You're not restoring a rule. Mm-hmm. And in order to be able to restore a relationship, you have to have a relationship in the first place.
Yeah.
So I just spent time with some administrators in a school district, and they very much understood that you needed to have relationships before you could do repair of harm work. Even though they wanted to do repair of harm right now because the point of pain is that they are disproportionately suspending black and brown students, and they don't want to do that. But it's more, the response has to be more sophisticated and deeper than just putting in a practice. The practice is only going to work if the people have the right mindset behind it, and if it has the supports around it. It doesn't work for one person to be the restorative person in the school when everyone else is still more than happy with the status quo of punishment for not following rules. So it's hard, I think, until you get to that level of basic understanding and some experience with what it feels like when you do repair of harm, and what it feels like when you are trying to build authentic relationships with people, people who look like you and people who don't look like you, then what is a barrier for you to be able to operate in a more authentically restorative way becomes clearer. And it also becomes clearer what kind of need you have. So there was a dean who said, I would say that he always operated in a restorative way, which people do, whether you give them the label or not. That, the word doesn't impart magic. But whenever a student was sent down to him, he would always go and talk to the teacher, to the point that he knew that some teachers wouldn't send students down to him because they didn't want to be talked to. Mm-hmm. They didn't want him to come and talk to them. But he wanted to know what was the deal, what happened, what was their part in it. How could they make it better? How could relationships be fixed? That's what he wanted to do. Well, that would be a lot easier if that dean worked in a building where that was the norm, that all of the deans did that, mm-hmm. that all of the principals did that the staff worked together to get to know each other so they could, have questions like that. And when I first started doing restorative practices, this is just a little side thing, I would teach circle, and we would do a basic values circle, and the value that came up a lot was respect. Respect. Everybody wanted respect. And of course that has so many meanings to different people. The story behind respect is always very interesting. More recently, perhaps because of COVID, and the upheaval of this last year, and the racial reckoning and concerns about climate change and the political upheaval, because of all of those things making life very unsteady and people having to respond very quickly to do things differently. The word that has been coming up more often in circles that I have been doing is grace and compassion. But particularly grace, because it wasn't one that I heard very often before. But we want to give each other grace because we're all human. Well, that's a support that would be really helpful for policy change. That's a support that would be really helpful for being able to do repair of harm in with integrity.
Yeah. A couple things stood out to me. One, relationship. Like that's what all of this work is about. A lot of the times I think we discount the relationship folks have with themselves, right? When we think about, hey, it's hard for me to be restorative with somebody else if I am not restorative with myself, right? If I don't have that right way of being with myself, if I'm too hard on myself, if I don't have grace for myself, like you were talking about, that's super important. But, in order, like you were saying, in order to have something to restore to, right, you have to have done that work, both, between staff and students, between adults in the buildings. I think a lot of times we don't think about like relationships with outside stakeholders, be they parents, caregivers, and other organizations. How have you seen that piece done well, to the extent that it can be done, given the constraints we have with time and the different communities that we're a part of?
Well, I can give you a I dream of answer,
Sure.
An example of a real thing. One of the things that I dream of is that meetings with external stakeholders and meetings particularly with family members be done in the spirit of circle, if not actually in circle. Mm-hmm. That they be welcomed in regardless of what the deal was. Whether their child, damaged a bunch of lockers and got into a big fight, or their child just won some award for being the best swimmer, that when they come into the school, they are welcomed and people are happy to see them and they're offered a cup of coffee and, they come into a space that has flowers on the table or something. That PTA meetings and PTO meetings and any other kind of parent-teacher meeting knows the people who run those know that part of their job is to get the parents to know each other, because that ensures safety amongst the children, particularly when the children go to a school that is not geographically bound. Mm-hmm. I grew up on a farm in a rural community, and my parents knew where everybody lived. And the parents saw each other, and we knew that if you did something wrong, somebody would call somebody else. So there was that whole, it takes a village kind of notion. And when I had my own children and I knew that there were students that were coming from all over the city, I was like, well, how in the world am I going to be able to keep track? When they say that Jamal is, really good at math, I have no context for Jamal because I don't know his parents. And so my dream is that, and maybe this does happen, that any kind of meeting of parents, there is a good amount of time spent on people being able to say who their kids are and who they are as people, so that we know that. An example of a place that was doing this well, I think, was an elementary school in St. Paul. So one of the things that I do for the Department of Education is I put on trainings around restorative practices throughout the year. Primarily in June, there's a big bunch of trainings that we have, and I'm always searching for good trainers and how to support trainers. And I also have shorter sessions that are sometimes offered, like 2-hour sessions. And I was looking for a trainer. And I asked a principal in a school, and I said, is there anybody in your school that you would recommend? And she recommended a parent. I had never, that was a couple of years ago, and it was like, oh, well, wow. So tell me more about this parent. Well, this parent was a very active parent. She was Hmong. She had a job, but she made working with the school one of the priorities in her life. And she had learned circle and was doing circle with parents and doing circle with staff and doing circle with kids. And she knew the process, and she was she was a good teacher. And so that was an example of, obviously something was going right amongst in the relationship between the parents and the family members in that school and the school, that that they could say, yeah, you want Bao. She's your person. And I think she would be great with this teacher, and, it would be fine. So there's a dream.
Yeah.
And there's the actuality. How they got to that point, I don't know the details of how they got to that point, of what the steps were that the school did to help the staff or help the family members learn the process and to engage them. But she was a volunteer, so I'm sure she saw a lot of circle in the classroom and then started keeping circle in the classroom. I kind of think that was the way that it went.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's, those opportunities for exposure, right? Wherever they exist within the context of your school, whether that is the PTO, PTA, local school council, even within like the parent staff meetings, right? How are people on staff embodying these values, right? Meeting these needs and inviting people in to have opportunities to learn, right? Like so many times we just learn by absorbing what's being modeled. And so that's really key. And now back to the original recording.
I'm going to revise my policy, and I'm going to start by establishing more relationships with people.
And I think situations that you're imagining and in other situations that I've talked about, how in the last year there have been so many institutions, not just schools, but let's talk about schools, who've been thinking about like, what do we need to do to revamp our policies to be explicitly less anti-Black, right? In general, like more equitable, but like it's because of anti-Blackness and anti-Black violence that like this last year has been a quote unquote racial reckoning. And we can look at data that says like what really changed, did attitudes really changed beyond like a 2-week period. Digressing from that, thinking about policy change without having people do the relational work isn't what's going to get us there. You've seen this work evolve a lot over the last, 20-ish years, right? How have you seen things change over the last calendar year?
Over the last calendar year?
In the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of this quote-unquote racial reckoning.
I can only speak for myself and my experience within the Department of Education. I can tell you, I have some perception about what's happening in the schools. I think that for myself, there has been more and more. I've engaged in much more learning. I've engaged in many more conversations explicitly about race and about privilege and about whiteness. I have learned the importance of affinity circles. That became really, really clear this year, that it was important for people to be able to meet with people who had a shared identity around being Black, around being Asian, LGBTQ, AI, around being white and wanting to do this work in a different way and being an ally. That's been something that I wouldn't have thought of before in such an explicit way. I learned that from my community. I think that there has been more attention within the agency, perhaps a bit more urgency. I don't know the motivations of all of the different decisions that were made, but I just see more explicit conversation. Mm-hmm. And it is even more clear that if one is going to be restorative, let me just go back to that question of policy and relationship. Sure. Yes, you have to have relationships in order to change policy. But even before you change the policy, you need to explore with the people who are going to implement the policy whether or not they have the mindset and perhaps some of the skills to be able to do the new policy. So I go back to that what I remember, I think I read or maybe heard someone say about eyes and seeing the students who come into your classroom. A child wants any human being wants to be liked, wants to feel as though somebody's happy to see them. And so even before you open up your mouth, when a child comes in and they're black or they're brown, or they have a disability, or they're not like you in whatever way that might be, can you still look at them like you're happy they're there? That you're glad that they're alive? That they've come into your room? It's not a nuance. It's a conscious thinking that, you have to work and think about to be sure that you can be welcoming to everyone. Like, it is always Thanksgiving in my classroom. It is always Thanksgiving in my building. I am happy for people to come in. Maybe that's not the right thing, not the right holiday to pick, but
okay. I might ask you to reframe that.
A different one, right?
Yeah.
It is always a not a party, but
celebration.
A dinner in my classroom. I am happy for you to come to my table and eat this food. If you can't start there, and be glad for the wonder of all of the children who come in to the building, policy changes is useful because it writes it down, but being able to pull it off is still going to be hard.
So I guess the question then is, what do you do with those people who can't get into that mindset?
What do you do with those people? Now, that is a very interesting question for a restorative practices practitioner. I guess that one continues to try to be in relationship with people.
Well, and just to be clear and specific to you and people who are listening, what do we do with adults who come into buildings with the assumption that I am not going to welcome all students, either consciously or unconsciously, however they show up into my classroom? What do you do with someone who holds that attitude? I'm here to teach my content, punch the clock, and leave.
Well, I guess, David, the question I would ask is whether or not they're in a school that has done any professional development around restorative practices, and whether or not that person's ever been invited to a circle. It's not 100%, but even an hour of people in small groups of 6 or 7 talking about who their family was and what their values are and why they are a teacher has been insightful to them about what they discovered about themselves and what they discovered about their colleagues. And that can lead to further exploration and further questions. Guess that if I were, I'd have to trust individuals to make choices that are best for them. And if people are continually being invited to circle, I would have to think that after a while, if they really didn't like it, they'd find another job. Or they would be influenced by what has happened, one or the other.
I'm thinking about how, one, it's not overnight change for a 30-something-year-old teacher who's been taught one way to shift the way that they are overnight. I also think a lot about how the way that we present this work, the way that we teach this work as people who are practitioners, trainers, consultants, right? I know the educator crowd is like, what are my takeaways? What are my things that I can apply immediately, right? But how are we framing this? Is what is the experience that you're going to have, and how is that experience going to influence you in the way that you continue to move in relationship with people? I don't know. It's tough to have people ask for hey, we want XYZ training in this hour and achieve these objectives. Is but how are we in relationship with each other? How are we going to build in that time to provide that experience where people can feel why are we with a need for this, feel why we need to do this. I don't know that this is 100% accurate, right? But Minnesota, more than many other places in the country, right, is a very predominantly white state, right? And demographics are changing, demographics are shifting, but it's not necessarily the case that students who are of the global majority, not the Minnesota majority, but of the global majority, aren't going to have teachers who share life experiences with at minimum, like a racial identity. So how are we making them more aware? And I think this is a question that is too big, too far for the conversation right here. But I think a big part of that is providing experiences for teachers, adults, to feel that sense of welcome, belonging, and then want to replicate that with everyone. You're going to need to learn skills and history and practices to do those things, because those are counter to so much of what dominant culture educational programming has been over the last however many years. But without having that experience of feeling that sense of belonging and knowing the steps that it takes to create that, and again, not that it's a linear process, it's really tough to ask somebody to do.
You ended that as a statement. What it makes me think is that a couple of things are true about Minnesota, and one is that we have some of the worst numbers in regards to disproportionality for students of color, for Black students, for students in particular, and they have the lowest graduation rates. Perhaps in the United States, they're improving a bit, but there's still that challenge. And the majority of educators in Minnesota, probably around 90% are white. And the kindergarten and first grade classes now are majority students of color. And that, of course, is the trend going forward. And so that just provides an enormous amount of importance, the importance of doing equity work side by side with restorative practices, and to not think that they are really in any way separate. Because in order to have that welcoming glance, you need to do some of your own work as an individual. I need to stop and think, well, who would I have a hard time smiling at when they come in and welcoming to my table? And what's that all about? And why would I be that way? And who can give me support to help me see every child, every student, every adult? You know, and that conversation, when we go back to policy, it's all tied together. Can I see the white supremacy policy, the elements in the policy that support the dominant culture? Everything about insubordination, disrespect, and disorderly conduct, to me, speaks of laws like spitting on the sidewalk. They are subjective, and you can apply them as you want to whomever you want, and they are disproportionately applied to kids of color. And so we have to know that. We have to recognize that in order to be able to decide we're going to change that policy. But more importantly, we have to know that and recognize that in order to be able to change our own personal behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. I'm curious, what is a way, you didn't always have this lens of racial equity and restorative justice go hand in hand, are inseparable. What's the way that you've reframed that for yourself as a practitioner of this work in the last couple of years?
Oh, I had a naive notion that if you just brought a whole bunch of people together and they had the opportunity to talk to each other, that would create a sense of connection and harmony and respect. And so I didn't have to be explicit about it. That was a really naive notion based on my own privilege. and also based on the fact that people were not in a position, or they didn't feel like they could trust me enough to tell me that. And so having people who are willing to be more explicit, and say, to point out omission and commission, what I do and what I don't do, and how that speaks volumes, in part because of who I am as a white woman, middle class, and the age that I am, and also as a representative of the Department of Education. That in the last 3 or 4 years has really been a journey, and I've it's something that will be dealing with all of my life, really, because you just don't change the system that we're in just like that in our own behaviors in relationship to it. So one example, I think, it had to do with discipline data. Mm-hmm. And for a number of years, I led almost every workshop with a presentation about the disproportionality. And there were a couple of years where I stopped doing it. And I'm not really exactly sure why. I think it had to do with me not getting the updated numbers. So I just, I knew I didn't have the most current numbers, and so I didn't use them. And then it became a bit of a habit. And someone pointed out to me that, no, you have to say what the reality is here in Minnesota. You can't avoid that. And of course, he was absolutely right. And it didn't matter that I did it for a couple of years. It's the fact that I wasn't doing it that was significant.
Right.
That's an example, a small example.
Yeah. I'm curious, zooming out from school and this work in education, this podcast is called This Restorative Justice Life. Not necessarily, or although it can be tied to like racial equity and racial justice in the intersection of what we call restorative justice practices. How has this way of being impacted the way that you move through the world?
One of the things, I have a dog, and I walk the dog a lot, and I want to be the friendliest dog walker on the block, regardless of who I encounter, particularly when I see young people. I remember a long time ago, 30 years ago, I was doing a training with some high school students, and they talked about how when they went into the mall, people looked at them with suspicion. They were white kids in a white community. And I thought, oh my word. Why? Because they're teenagers, right? And so I'm more thoughtful about that. I'm also, people might not notice it so much, but I'm trying to step back and encourage other voices to speak. I want to refer people to other folks, not me. I don't want to be as visible. I want to coordinate, but there are such excellent practitioners who can explain much better than I can what restorative practices are about now, and they are people of color. And there are people with, as I said, with practice, with their own lived experience with it in the classroom, in the schools, in the districts. And I think it's important for them to be highlighted. I try to listen more closely to the community and figure out ways to give what it is that they need. So one of the things that we did this last year was that we offered affinity circles in the training that we do in June, because that was something that people said that they needed to be in a space where it was easier and people could be honest. And so those are some of the things that come to my mind right now. I also, I'm not sure that my writing is more important anymore. I would prefer to encourage other voices and other people to write. And if I do, I want to do it in partnership with a person of color, because it just feels better to me.
Yeah. Being where you are, having so much time and experience and knowledge, and also recognizing the need for others, have you logistically navigated some of those things? Because for me, I see you as someone who has done a lot in all of this, right? And I'm someone who, I'm 30 years old. I'm not that young, right? There are lots of people who are younger than me who are experiencing things a lot closer to school age, right? I would be remiss if I wasn't shouting out Elise, who is the producer of this podcast, who also gets to add her voice and reflections into the conversation that we're having right now for the people. The second person who appeared on this podcast, Griffin Castillo, he is a college freshman now, but had just come out of high school. And I'm thinking a lot about what does it look like even to have that kind of mindset as a 30-year-old, right? I'm 12 years removed from education like that. How have you thought those things through?
One of the ways that I have at my disposal is to work with the community to figure out who would be trainers for the trainings that the Department of Education offers. Mm-hmm. We had 50 adult trainers in June and 5 student trainers. And so that was another milestone for me, kind of a little bit embarrassing that it's taken that long to be able to figure out how to get young people to provide training at in the June training. But at any rate, we were able to do that. People ask me, will you do this? Will you do that? Will you do the other thing? And I go, why don't you talk to so-and-so? Why don't you go to so-and-so? Why don't you? I would recommend somebody else. I don't travel anymore. That's always a good excuse. Mm-hmm. And encouraging people to talk to other people. It is it's a delicate balance between having had enough experience to be able to have something to share, and your age, I guess. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And
when you're 65 years old, somebody who's 30 is like, yeah, you're young, whatever. It's all
right.
relative.
I think part of that is my baggage of being brought into spaces oh, you're the youth voice. I'm like, am I? Oh. I'm just half your age. And so there are ways that I am thinking about it, but I was just curious, as someone who has been doing this for much longer, not to say anything about the time, but the experience of elevating those other voices and what that looked like for you. We're getting down to the time where I want to start asking the questions that everyone answers. We've talked around it a lot, but define restorative justice.
Well, this is the sort of thing where I'd like to, quick go to my website. Mm-hmm. Today, restorative justice for me is an individual journey of relationships and everything that it takes to be able to be in good relationship or right relationship with other people. Mm-hmm. That's what restorative justice is.
As you've gone on this journey as an individual, what has been an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, when I saw that question, I thought, oh, what am I going to say to that one? That's really interesting. For me, those have been always times when my myopia as a white woman has really been really obvious. And a simple example was pointed out to me by a group of administrators who were men of color that as I told stories in the morning session of a day-long session that I was doing, I only identified kids of color. I didn't identify white kids. I just said the kids. And they said, well, what's up with that? What, you're just assuming that we were going to know? And why would you say they were African American? when you didn't say that they were white.
Yeah.
And so that was an interesting point. I had another example of that where somebody pointed that out, the way in which I talked about a student who was Ojibwe. And she took me aside at a break and said, I have these problems with this. The benefit of restorative practices is that if I can stay settled and focused in myself, I can stand up then afterwards and apologize and point out what I learned and try to, in that way, make a kind of amends for what I've done. I've had bigger mistakes that were much harder to try to fix. Just not thinking about what I was saying, not thinking about how it would land on the ears of Black and brown people and the experiences that they have. Trying to make a connection. There was one time where I was trying to make a connection with the experiences of Black and brown people, and that's not ever going to be my reality. Nobody's going to follow me when I'm in the store. Nobody is going to search me at the TSA because of the color of my skin. And so that was particularly difficult and embarrassing, and because I had harmed not just some people in the audience but also some colleagues. And what I know is that for myself, I need to be prepared. It's like a good Boy Scout. You cannot. I find that I should not walk into a training or a circle without being centered in myself, and I need to remember that it's okay to take a breath before I say something. Mm-hmm. And those two things usually help quite a bit. If I have prepared myself in terms of content, but in terms of my own emotional self.
Yeah. I think about that piece a lot. I'm obviously not a white woman, right? But I think about the ways that the intersections of my identity as a cis het man play out in these different dynamics and like with relative financial privilege and all of these things, right? When those things go unnamed, that barrier is still there. And it is on people who are on the other side of that, who are marginalized, who are oppressed, to have to like tiptoe around like how I'm going to navigate it, or to know whether or not it's okay for them to like call something out because of the way that I'm invoking heteropatriarchal expectations onto them. Where if I'm naming those things up front and being like, this is who I am and this is what I'm working on to be better, but I'm not going to get it right 100% of the time. And in this space, we want everybody to be respected and celebrated for who they are. And if something that I, even as a facilitator, am doing in this space that does that, like, I need to know, and I would very much appreciate that call in, that notification. So helpful. And one of my colleagues who's a woman of color talked to me, like talked that through with me. So thankful for that lesson and many others. Neither of us are perfect, but that was a great answer to that question. This one is maybe tougher, but in a different way. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they? And what is the question you ask the circle?
I'm going to set aside my relatives, and I'm going to go with some historical people. I think it's Pope Gregory who wrote that the thing about discovery that set up the ability of the European countries to feel as though they have the document of discovery. Is that what it's called?
Dum Diversas. We might be talking about something different. Dum diversas is this idea that it was okay for Portugal to go and enslave West Africans. And that was by Pope Nicholas V. The doctrine of discovery.
Okay, so Pope Nicholas, that'll be good.
Mm-hmm.
I think the guy who wrote the Doctrine of Discovery, I think he was a Gregory, was he? Or
Pope Alexander, the papal bull Inter Cartera.
Yeah.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Him, those two guys, Ferdinand and Isabella. So that's 4.
Okay. What's the question you would ask the circle?
What were you thinking? That would be the question I would ask. What were you thinking?
I feel like the answer is like, I want to increase my kingdom's wealth.
I would keep asking that question. Just like you kept asking, who are you, who are you, who are you? Mm-hmm. Or maybe it would be, who are you, who are you, who are you? Because before you can know what people were thinking and whether or not they're answering the question with any kind of honesty, it's like, who are you, who are you, who are you?
I love that. So many times people do bring in their relatives and people who have inspired them. Rarely, I don't know if ever, people have brought in the perpetuators of great global harm to invite them into questioning what they did. Thank you for that. And this might be the answer to the question. I've asked this in many different ways, and I get very different responses. What's one place or situation that you've witnessed recently that you wish people really knew this work? And specific situations. So I think what is appropriate, to question Ferdinand and Isabella about what were you thinking when you were sending people to explore the world and conquer. That fits within this box, but something much more recent.
Okay, I would have appreciated if off to the side at any of the times that people felt it is important to challenge the city, challenge police departments, be in front of precincts, be in places where people have been killed. If there were a couple of spaces where people could sit together in circle. In addition, it's not either or, it's both and. Because we need advocates, we need people who are clear and they challenge and they speak truth to power. But we also need to have a space where people can have a little respite and be able to sit down and talk to each other in a way that is slows everything down. Mm. I have no idea how we make something like that happen. But it's something that I have often imagined. Even if there was a place where a person could sit across from somebody that they're frustrated with and play checkers just for 10 minutes and then get up and go back to your corners.
Thank you for that. That's something that we definitely need. What's one thing, mantra or affirmation you want everyone listening to this podcast to know?
Relationships before rules. All behavior is communication. Breathe.
2 more questions. You've got to help me out with this part. Who's one person I should have on this podcast?
Becky McCammon and Kurt Rukim.
I don't know either of those people.
Yeah. Becky McCammon was the Restorative Practices district lead for the St. Paul Public Schools. She's just left to start her own company, Restoratively Yours. You can look it up. And Kurt Rukim was an RP lead in St. Paul and is now in the district office. Really thoughtful people. Becky is a Korean adoptee American, as is Kurt. And they have been engaged deeply and profoundly from the beginning, and even before the beginning of the restorative journey in St. Paul, which is about now going into their 6th year officially, but it's been longer than that.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for those. And the last thing, I know you said, don't come to me, but where can people support you in your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
One of the ways that people can support my work in the ways that I want it to be supported is in their positions of power or responsibility or connection, to look to the people who have the lived experience with restorative practices and circle, to not have degrees and positions be the first thing that they look for. One of the things that I know is that the diversity in the staff in schools in Minnesota lie with the behavior deans and the cultural liaisons and the educational aides. And that is where the knowledge is about being restorative in a really small R way. And I would really encourage people to elevate those people in our schools and give them honor and respect.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for being here, for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, your stories with us. Is there anything else that you want to leave the folks with?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to do this, David. It's been very fun to talk to you.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who's listening. We'll be back next week with another episode diving into what it means to live this restorative justice life. Until then, take care.
Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciated how Nancy brought up the idea of policy changes. Policy changes are so important to institutional development and growth, but at the same time, we also have to seek the relational side of policy changes. Effective implementation of policy requires being in relationship with one another, as well as being honest, having humility, and holding accountability if the policy changes aren't actively serving the communities that they are supposed to serve. Policy changes don't mean that we can sit back and relax. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think that true change can be found from the intersection between systemic change and social and emotional change. Nancy also said that practice is only going to work if the people have the right mindset behind it. I think that this is also true to the policy change that she was talking about. Who are we trying to serve, and how are we working together to do that? As always, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode, and I can't wait to see you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.